Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America and the Blue Funk Broadcasting Radio Network. Great to have you with us on the program today. As mentioned, our guest is SusanSachsGoldman, author of the book Friends Indeed, The Story of Quaker Social Reform in America. Susan, great to have you with us on the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
There are so many interesting things to talk about, and I guess let's go back to the beginning. Let's do a little history lesson for everybody here. Just exactly who are the Religious Society of Friends? Where did they come from? And let's talk about the basics, and then we'll talk about what's going to probably surprise a lot of people, the great influence they've had on our society ever since they've been here.
The Religious Society of Friends was a part of the Puritan Revolution in England in the mid-17th century, 1630s, 1640s. They were originally Puritans. They were part of the dissenters, who were embroiled in a lot of religious ferment against the Anglican Church of that era. The Quakers were widely persecuted, both because they were zealous and because they were nonconformists. When Oliver Cromwell and the Puritan armies established the Commonwealth and Charles I was deposed, the Cromwell's forces persecuted the Quakers as well, despite the fact that they had originally been Puritans like him. And eventually many Quakers, having suffered terribly for that mid-century period, migrated to the proprietary colony given to William Penn, a British Quaker, in the New World, and set up their colony called the Holy Experiment in 1671. About then was when the first numbers of Quakers arrived in America. So there are Quakers in England and in many Commonwealth countries and in Africa today, and there are about 80 to 100, perhaps 110,000 Quakers in America.
What is amazing is you read the book Friends Indeed, The Story of Quaker Social Reform in America. The book is available all across the country, of course, at Amazon. Go to our website. You can log on and get all that information. The impact they've had on our country, and doing it with such a small number, you just gave me what is, I can't believe that's all the representation. Yeah. Yes.
Very small, very small. And the motivation to advocate for social justice is a fundamental religious obligation of Quakers. Their main goal is to establish peace on earth, peace in this world, so that everyone has the serenity and the opportunity to find the light of God within him or herself. And Quakers recognize that there can be no peace without equality and social justice. And so each Quaker has this moral, spiritual obligation, really, to advocate in the public arena to eradicate the social inequities around in the world. And they have taken that obligation very seriously and have engaged in this public advocacy in every social reform issue in our history.
It's interesting you talk about there's really no dividing line between religious and secular.
Exactly. Not in this sense. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
SusanSachsGoldman is our guest on the program. Friends Indeed, The Story of Quaker Social Reform in America is the book. On the cover is a great painting. It's Peaceable Kingdom. Tell us a little bit about this and why you chose that, because when you look at that graphically, that tells us what we're about to read.
That's exactly right. That painting was painted in the mid-19th century by a Quaker artist named Edward Hicks. It is a picture of a chapter of Isaiah that's a very favorite verse of Quakers because it speaks about the lion laying down with the lamb, about all creatures on earth getting along peaceably. And in the back of this scene is a smaller scene which represents William Penn treating with the Delaware Indians, the indigenous peoples who were there on the banks of the Delaware River when the Quakers arrived, trying to establish from the very beginning respectful and peaceful relations with the Native Americans, which the Quakers in Pennsylvania managed to do for 75 years, and their record was, of course, unique among the colonies. So it's a very important evocation of that iconic meeting with the Delaware Indians under what is called the shakamak and elm in the 1670s in Pennsylvania, as seen behind an evocation of the lion laying down with the lamb.
Why is it that we know so little about Quakers?
It's a very good question, and I don't know the complete answer, but I think at least one factor is that Quakers take this obligation for social reform in the public arena very seriously, as they do their testimony of simplicity and their aversion to self-promotion. A common kind of aphorism is that Quakers hide their light under a basket. They don't do this for public recognition. They don't seek it. They actually eschew it in many cases. And I think they don't write their own history, nor do they particularly encourage others to do so. They are less interested, I find, anecdotally among my Quaker friends, they appear to be less interested in rehearsing the glorious accomplishments of their past than they are in examining today what they can do to make tomorrow a more just and equitable world.
From your background, you've got a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. You went on to earn a Master of Arts in American History from Brandeis.
That's
Was
right.
this a surprise to you when you did the research that, like, okay, I knew some of this, but wow, these people have had a really amazing influence on where we are as a country?
I had not a full idea of how remarkable this record is and how compelling the line of social reform is for the 350 years since their settlement. I think anyone reading the book who's taken a high school history course will recognize many of the names of the reformers, but they may not recognize, as I did not always recognize when I did the research, that so many of these people are Quaker.
It's interesting. Friends Indeed, by the way, the book, The Story of Quaker Social Reform in America, Susan Sachs-Goldman, our guest on the program. The book is available all across the country. Information on the book at our website, thisweekinamerica.us. I would like to talk about some of the different examples that you give that I was not aware of. We're all aware of the famous Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech back in 1963. And actually, one of the main organizers was a Quaker, and he was pretty much responsible for the whole nonviolent movement at the time.
He was a big influence on King in terms of developing his nonviolent approach. This gentleman's name was Bayard Rustin. He is actually underappreciated, I think, historically for many of the wonderful things he did in search of peace and civil rights for African Americans, because he was homosexual in the mid-20th century, and that was not a popular practice at the time, and I think he was out of favor for that reason and is perhaps underappreciated for the work that he did with King and others.
And you look, too, at medicine. The early days, the female doctors, and I'm not talking early days like 50 years ago. I'm talking a long time ago. A large number of the female doctors at the time were Quakers.
That's exactly right. Because of their testimony of equality, another fundamental belief among Quakers, the genders are considered equal, and women have always been treated equally within the Quaker fold and encouraged to speak at meetings for worship and meetings for business. They have been educated right alongside their brothers. The Nantucket whaling empire, the whole global whaling empire of the late 19th century was headquartered in Nantucket, which was run by Quakers, which the population was a majority Quaker. And the men of the island would go off for years at a time searching for sperm whales in the South Pacific. And that system could not have produced the lucrative whaling sperm oil empire had the women not been educated and formidable enough to carry on small businesses in order to raise families alone, on their own, for 2 to 3 years at a time.
One of the graphics in the book, Friends Indeed, the Story of Quaker Social Reform in America, is the Women's Rights Parade in Washington, D.C. That happens, and we know that, except this was 100 years ago.
That's right. That's right. Alice Paul was a Quaker from New Jersey who graduated from Swarthmore and went over to learn the methods of the British suffragists under Emmeline Pankhurst, and brought back a very savvy knowledge of utilizing utilizing public awareness in order to promote women's rights. So she organized this campaign, this parade down Pennsylvania Avenue to coincide with Woodrow Wilson's inauguration in order to bring more attention to the women's drive for suffrage. It was a highly controversial issue. The parade dissolved into violence along the way because so many onlookers were horrified at the scandalous behavior of the women who were marching, and the Washington police didn't do anything to stop the violence. This group and others also chained themselves to the gates of the White House and had to be forcibly removed. They were jailed. They were force-fed, which is a very painful procedure, as we're hearing now about cases of this in Guantanamo. And the women under Alice Paul, many other Quaker women and other women as well, agitated very forcefully, and finally in 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed and women got the vote.
The book is called Friends Indeed, The Story of Quaker Social Reform in America. Susan Sachs-Goldman, our guest on This Week in America. The book is excellent. It's available all across the country. You can order it on Amazon. All that information you can link on with Susan at our website, thisweekinamerica.us. It used to be years ago that people that had mental illness, we basically shackled them up. I mean, we locked them away. That was it. And the Quakers came forward and said, we're going to try to cure these people. I mean, they were at the forefront once again of treating mentally ill people, actually treating and curing mentally ill people.
Exactly. And not punishing them or using or setting them up as victims of abuse and at really terrible behavior. There was a famous hospital that we still refer to in England, in London, in the 18th century called Bethlehem Hospital, and we refer to it now as Bedlam. And was called Bedlam because the patients were shackled, as you say, and made fun of. It was just an inhumane situation. And Quakers from the 17th century in England, and then continuing once they got to America, always advocated and employed in their own mental institutions a rehabilitative, benign treatment called the moral treatment for mental patients, with the hope that they could in fact get well. They built asylums that utilized outdoor fresh air, the opportunity to be quiet and on one's own. They provided occupation and training for the patients so that they could do something productive and begin to believe themselves that they might be productive citizens once again.
In the book, Friends Indeed, you talk about their pacifism, and except in the Civil War, they really came forward there and said, this is wrong. The outrage of slavery really overrides everything else. All of our principles, we're fighting for this.
Some Quakers did. Some did refuse to fight, believing that the peace testimony trumped all others. But so many Quakers, as you say, were so appalled at the injustice of the slavery system that they forsook that peace testimony and instead fought for the testimony of equality, and were not disowned, it was called, from their meetings because of it. In World War I, there were similar feelings among some Quakers that it was wrong to fight, and they tried to establish themselves as conscientious objectors. They were reviled then, as they had been during every other war in American history, their pacifism being considered unpatriotic in the extreme during wartime fever that always overtook the country at those times. But in the Civil War, you're absolutely right. Many Quakers did fight for the northern side, and generally were not punished by their meetings or their parishes for doing so.
We've got about 2 minutes left in the program. You were really inspired, I understand, to write this book as your 3 children attended the Sidwell Friends School in Washington, D.C. You became very active in the Board of Trustees at the school as well. Talk about that impact that this training had on you and your 3 children.
Well, I all 3 of my children went there for 14 years each from pre-kindergarten, and I began to osmose from their educational experience, if I could make up a verb.
I like that.
Some of the values that were imparted to them in a relatively indirect way. The Quakers don't proselytize. Consequently, the values of respect and simplicity and equality were taught to the children in a way that left many of them embracing those values, but not being 100% clear that they were actually Quaker values that had been imparted to them. When I went on the Board of Trustees, which is a majority Quaker, during that period when the kids were in school, I was confronted with a group of people who did business and faced problems in a way I had never experienced before. They were not only open-minded, but they, in a way, were open-hearted. They didn't always agree with each other or anybody else substantively, but they all seemed to have a similar way of trying to get all the information and utilizing firm conviction, coupling firm conviction with a real compassion and desire to understand all sides. They don't vote. The Sidwell Friends Board operates in what is called the manner of friends. They they resolve issues by a sense of the meeting, which many people consider consensus. It's close enough. And it sometimes took a very long time when the issues were difficult. But at the end of the day, when the resolution was taken, half the room didn't leave angry because they had lost a vote. So I was so impressed with the way this group kind of led the board by their example that I began to study up, since I love history, and very quickly in my reading about Quakers, this remarkable and relatively unknown history of their social reform rose to the top and attracted my interest and produced this book.
Well, that's what's so interesting with the book, because we find out things that we didn't know before, or we might have sort of hinted, like you said, through history that some of these things happen. We weren't aware of the magnitude.
That's right.
And also, it's like, man, if it works for them, maybe we could use a lot of that today. What are some of the issues, the social issues they're concerned about today?
They continue being concerned and advocating in Washington and elsewhere for the rights of Native Americans, for the civil rights of Native Americans. They are still active in civil rights among African Americans. They promote peace in Afghanistan. They are concerned about environmental stewardship. They're very concerned about climate control, and they work to alleviate the effects of that and to change the way we operate in the world so as to mitigate those ill effects of human contributions. They work, and they continue to work, I think importantly, they continue to extend humanitarian relief all around, in this country, but more importantly, all around the world, to people who suffer the ravages of either man-made or natural catastrophe. So they are serving as an NGO, most iconically under the aegis of the American Friends Service Committee, to alleviate the sufferings of civilians in war-torn areas or people who suffer from famine because of war or because of natural catastrophe.
Well, you read the book, it becomes an inspiration to all of us to lead a life like that and really leave a legacy as you move forward here. The book is excellent. Friends Indeed. The story of Quaker social reform in America. Our guest on the program has been Susan Sachs-Goldman. Susan, thank you so much for joining us. A fascinating book, and great to have you with us on the program.
Thank you, Rick. I've enjoyed it.
You're listening to This Week in America on the Blue Funk Broadcasting Radio Network.